Great, now you know what bokeh is because I explained that in the previous lecture. And in this lecture, I'll show you how to build a very basic bokeh graph. And yeah, so we'll start from scratch and step by step we will improve that graph. Yeah, let's say this is your first bokeh graph, or maybe you have built bokeh graphs before. So before taking this course, and you know a few things already, still I would suggest you start from here, because I'll show you the correct logic towards building graphs step by step. And yeah, let's go ahead and do this. I'll be using, sometimes I'll be using a Jupyter notebook to write Python code, and in other times I'll be using the Atom editor. So the Jupyter notebook is a good place to start actually, because it will allow us to write some interactive code. We can just write a single line of code and see what it does. So that's great for starting off with a library, so you can explore the library by testing small pieces of code. And yeah, with Shift and right click on Windows over folder, you can go over here and open a command window here. And this will open a command prompt in the current folder. So on a Mac or Linux, you can maybe do something like open terminal here, or you can open a terminal normally, and then you can cd to the path, to your working path. So I'll be writing the code in this directory. And to install Jupyter, you would say pip install Jupyter notebook. And this is a requirement already satisfied because I've already installed Jupyter notebook. If you haven't, you can just go ahead and do this, and you know it will be installed for you. And then to start Jupyter notebook, you'd say Jupyter notebook, just like that, and that will open a Jupyter notebook on localhost, so it's like a service-based notebook. And yeah, if you create now, you create a Python 3 notebook and name it basic graph, just like that. And in the demo folder, you'll have this basic graph.ipynb, which stands for IPython notebook, but now IPython notebook is renamed to Jupyter notebook, but the extension still stays the same. And you also have these checkpoints, which are files automatically produced when Jupyter saves your sessions. Now you should keep your command prompt open, and then this is where you write the code. And yeah, if you don't prefer to use Jupyter notebooks, you can use your favorite editor. So that should be Atom or Vim or the default Python IDE, and so on. It doesn't matter much. And I'll be using comments to comment my code, and that will help you read and understand my code easier, because you know I'll be writing some code here and some code, and later on like that, and I'll be explaining the code as I type it in, but sometimes you forget what I typed here and you're struggling to understand it. But if I have some comments here, let's say plotting the x and y values, and if I write this comment here, Python will not read it as code, so it will ignore it, but you can read it, and you will assume that I'm writing this comment for the next block. So I write the comment, I leave no space, and I type the code there. And then I leave a space there, and I type some other code there, so it's another block that doesn't have to do with this comment. So this comment will be about this block of code there. Sometimes I may want to apply specific comments about specific lines, for example this one here. In that case, I'll write the comment just there. So let's say for the x values here, or something like that. Great. And the first comment will usually be about the script. So what we'll be doing is making a basic bokeh graph. This will be a line graph. Great. And I'll leave a space there, and here I start the code. So first of all, I'll be importing Bokeh, and I'll be explaining this later, but Bokeh has a few interfaces, and the first interface is bokeh.plotting. So it's called the bokeh.plotting interface, and I'll be going through the interfaces later. So for now, let's focus on how a graph looks like and how the code looks like to build a Bokeh graph. So from Bokeh plotting import, you import the figure object, which is the most important object in Bokeh, because this will contain like a container where you add points, you add lines, and you add labels for the points, and you add grids for the plot, legends and everything. So you'll add everything into this figure object. That's it. And then you need to have some helpful tools from Bokeh. That comes from bokeh.io interface. So from that you want to import output file and show. And yeah, that's basically what we need. You'll see what all these are in just a bit. And then we need to create some data. So let's create some fake data there. Prepare some data. I'll be using lists. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that's for the x-axis. So in the plot, these values will be mapped along the x-axis, and then we have the y-axis there. Let's say 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Note that these lists have to have the same length, so in order to plot them in Bokeh. Otherwise, Bokeh will throw an error. It will say that, Bokeh will start to take pairs of this list. So it will take 1 and 6, and it will map these along the x and the y axis. So it will create a point with coordinates 1 and 6, and then 2 and 7, and so on. And it goes to 5 and 10. And then if you add a line, number here, say 7 or whatever, Python will say, oh, I didn't find a pair for 7 in the y-axis, so you'll get an error. Great. So we have the data. Prepare the output file. So here is where you use the output file function, and there you pass the name of the HTML file that will be created. So you can choose every name you want. And then the next thing to do is you want to create a figure object instance. So you have the figure class there, you have imported it, and you can use it now, just like that. So I'm storing that in the f variable. Let me comment this. Create figure object. And then finally, create line plot. And the way to create the line plot is by referring to the figure object that you created, and then you apply the line method if you want to create a line. And the line expects from you to pass the x array with data and the y array as well. So note that everything I'm passing here are the minimum requirements to build a plot. But there's a lot of features that we will be adding later here in the code, so that we enrich our plots with features such as legends and labels and colors and transparency, etc. But this is the backbone, so to say. And once you have created a line, all you have left to do is use the show method to show your figure object. And yeah, to execute that in Jupyter, you can just press Ctrl and Enter. Wait a second. And I got an error there. Output, yeah, it should be output file, sorry. I execute again, and here is the line graph. And yeah, if you look at this, you see that the first point of the line is at coordinates 1, so this is the x-axis, 1 for the x, 6 for the y. If you look here, it's 1 and 6, and then you have 2 and 7 and so on up to the last point, which is 5 to 10. 5 and 10, yeah. So now that's a graph. And this is not an image graph. As you can see, I can move this around, and you also have a couple of tools here. So these are called tools. And what you can do with these is, let's say this is a pen, and if you see this vertical blue line here, that means that the pen tool is already activated. And if I move my cursor like that, I'll pan around the graph. If you click, let's say, the wheel zoom, you'll see that both pan and the wheel zoom are activated now, and I can use the wheel of my mouse to zoom in and out. And yeah, now remember that I told you Bokeh produces interactive graphs. So here it is. However, this is just a basic functionality of interactivity, because later, as I told you earlier, I will be adding widgets here that interact very powerfully with a graph. And yeah, basically, I also have this box zoom, that you can zoom in a certain area of your graph. You also have this reset tool there, which actually resets the graph to its default view. And what's left? We have this help button, which brings you to the Bokeh documentation, and I'll go through the Bokeh documentation later, which is very helpful for you to get help from. And it's also a save button in here, which you can use to save your plots in PNG graphs, images. So if you ever want to convert your graphs to images, you can use that button. And yeah, that's about building a basic graph, and I'd like to give you some practice activity now. You know, here I used a line graph, but you can use other types of glyphs. This is how these geometries are called in Bokeh. And you can get an idea of what glyphs you can use, you can apply to your figure by doing dir and f, which is the object instance of your figure object. You will see here, let's find line. Here is line, so that's the one you used. But I'd like to ask you to make your own graphs using triangle first, and then a circle. So that will be very easy. Instead of line, just pass these things here and see what you get. But try to make the graph from scratch instead of copying mine. And let me comment this, I forgot to comment this. You can also play around with some other data to see how that goes, and yeah, that will make sure that you understand how to create a very basic Bokeh plot. And in the next lecture, I'll show you how to use some more real data. So we use lists here, but in the next lecture we will use CSV files. So plotting from a CSV file. I will be creating the same graph. See you there.